Okay, everyone, it's time to read Mr. Silly. Let's read together. Mr. Silly lives in Nonsense Land, which is a very funny place to live. You see, in Nonsense Land, everything is as silly as can be. In Nonsense Land, the trees are red, and the grass is blue. Isn't that silly? Look at this. This is a red tree that grows in Nonsense Land, and the grass is blue. That's so silly. In Nonsense Land, dogs wear hats. And do you know how birds fly in Nonsense Land? No, they don't fly forwards. They fly backwards. It really is a very silly place indeed. Which, of course, is why Mr. Silly lives there. There's a dog wearing a hat. Dogs wear hats in Nonsense Land. Mr. Silly, in fact, lives in quite the silliest looking house you have ever seen in your whole life. Have you ever seen a sillier looking house than that? This is Mr. Silly's house. Isn't that silly? Now, this particular story is all about the Nonsense Cup. You see, in Nonsense Land, each year they hold a competition, and the cup is awarded to whoever has the silliest idea of the year. Mr. Silly had never won the cup, but each night, lying in bed, he dreamed about winning it. There's Mr. Silly, lying in bed, dreaming about winning the Nonsense Cup. In order to win the Nonsense Cup, Mr. Silly realized that he would have to think of something remarkably silly. He pondered over the problem one morning at breakfast. Incidentally, you may be interested to know what Mr. Silly was having for breakfast. He was having a cup of coffee, which he put a spoonful of marmalade into. After that, he had a cornflake sandwich. And to finish, he had a boiled egg. But being Mr. Silly, he ate the shell as well. Isn't that a silly breakfast? There's Mr. Silly's breakfast with coffee, with marmalade in it. Marmalade is like jam. And here's his sandwich with cornflakes in it. And here's his egg. He ate the shell and the egg. Anyway, this particular breakfast time, Mr. Silly was thinking how to win that cup. He remembered 2 years ago the cup was won by Mr. Ridiculous. He won by wallpapering his house, which sounds very ordinary, but in fact, Mr. Ridiculous had wallpapered the outside of his house. There's Mr. Ridiculous's house. He put the wallpaper on the outside of his house. That is very silly. And Mr. Silly remembered last year when Mr. Foolish won the cup. Mr. Foolish, who was a friend of Mr. Silly's, had won the cup by inventing a car. It was quite a normal car, apart from one thing. It had square wheels. Isn't that silly? There's the car that Mr. Foolish invented, and the wheels are square. That's so silly. Mr. Silly thought and thought and thought, but it was no good. He even had another cup of coffee with marmalade, but that didn't help either. So he decided to take a walk. Off he went, leaving his front door open so that he wouldn't have burglars when he was out. There he goes. He's going for a walk. He's leaving his door open. On his walk, Mr. Silly met a chicken wearing Wellington boots and carrying an umbrella. Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear Wellington boots and carry an umbrella? He said to the chicken. Meow, said the chicken, because Animals in Nonsense Land don't make the same noises as they do in your country. There's the chicken. In Nonsense Land, chickens have umbrellas, and they wear boots, and they say, meow. On his walk, Mr. Silly met a worm wearing a top hat, monocle, and an old school tie. Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear a top hat, a monocle, and an old school tie? He said to the worm. Quack, quack, said the worm. There's the worm. In Nonsense Land, worms wear top hats and monocles and ties. And they say, quack, quack. It's very silly. Next, Mr. Silly met a pig wearing trousers and a bowler hat. Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear trousers and a bowler hat? He asked the pig. Ooh, said the pig. Isn't that silly? There's the pig. He's wearing a hat, trousers, and he says, ooh. It was in the middle of Mr. Silly's walk that he had his idea. It was a beautifully silly idea. Quite the silliest idea he'd ever had. He hurried into town and bought himself a pot of paint and a paintbrush. There's Mr. Silly. He has an idea. He has a silly idea. He has the silliest idea he has ever thought of. I wonder what it is. Something with paint. He has paint and a paintbrush. What do you think Mr. Silly is going to do? The day of the great awarding of the Nonsense Cup arrived. A huge crowd assembled in the city square to see who was going to win the cup. The king of Nonsense Land mounted the specially built platform. Ladies and gentlemen, he said to the crowd in the city square, it is my pleasure today to award the Nonsense Cup to whoever has the silliest idea of the year. There is the king of Nonsense Land. He is going to give the Nonsense Cup. One of the silliest ideas of the year, continued the king, is by Mr. Muddle, the farmer. He has managed to grow, of all things, a square apple. The crowd clapped as the square apple was held up by Mr. Muddle for everybody to see. He felt sure he was going to win. There's Mr. Muddle, and there is his square apple. Maybe that will win the Nonsense Cup. Let's see who else. However, said the king, and Mr. Muddle's face fell, we have had an even sillier idea entered by Mrs. Nincompoop. It was a teapot. Quite the silliest teapot there had ever been. The crowd broke into thunderous applause. I therefore have great pleasure, announced the king, in presenting the Nonsense Cup to... Just then, he looked up and stopped in astonishment. There's the teapot. Isn't this a silly teapot? Look at this. What a silly teapot. Now, in the middle of the city square, there is a tree. It's always been there. And it was at this tree that the king was looking in astonishment. What, he cried, has happened to that tree? Everybody turned to look. The tree had green leaves. Bright green leaves. Not red leaves like all the trees in Nonsense Land, but green. There was an amazed silence. It was me, piped up Mr. Silly. I painted all the leaves green last night when you were asleep. Mr. Silly painted the leaves green. "A green tree?" exclaimed the king. "Who ever heard of a green tree?" "A green tree!" shouted the crowd. "How silly!" And they started to applaud. Mr. Silly smiled modestly. The king held up his hands. "I think," he said, "that this is the silliest idea I have ever heard of, and therefore I award the nonsense cup to Mr. Silly." The crowd cheered and cheered. Mr. Silly went pink with pride. There's Mr. Silly. He won the nonsense cup for his painted green trees. And a bird perched high up in the branches of the silly green tree looked down. "Woof," it said, and flew off backwards. Okay, that is the end of our story. I hope you liked it. Now it's time to look at your workbook.